Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. We're going to start the program in just a minute or two, but please note if you can see the screen, if you are dialing in to the webinar program, there are some issues with audio if you dial in via your phone or a landline. We suggest that you actually download the GoToWebinar app. You can join the webinar through the app. Just click on join webinar from your email confirmation, download the app as directed, and then the webinar will launch and you can join audio that way through the actual app. Just want to make sure folks are aware that there are some difficulties if you are dialing into the actual phone number that's associated with this program. If that doesn't work for you, note that the presentation, along with the transcript and a recording, will be available on the Broadband USA website under events/past events on or before June 16th, 2021. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Broadband USA's webinar. My name is Susanna Spellman with NTIA's Broadband USA program. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to NTIA's Broadband USA website. Today's webinar focuses on NTIA's Broadband Infrastructure Program and is the second of a four-part series. Before we begin, I would like to review the logistics for today's webinar. First, we will open up the webinar for questions after the completion of the presentations. As you hear from each presenter, please use the question box on the right-hand side of the screen to submit your questions or comments. Second, the presentation along with the transcript and audio recording of today's session will be available on the Broadband USA website within 7 days of this webinar under the Events/Past Events tab. Finally, please visit our Broadband USA website for more information about our technical assistance programs, including useful guides, products, publications, and other tools that can assist you with planning, funding, and implementing your broadband project. We provide updated information regularly, including a monthly newsletter and other broadband news. Our presenters today are Doug Kinkoff, the Associate Administrator of the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications, and Jennifer Duane, Director for Grants of the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications. Now we will turn to our first speaker, Doug Kinkoff. Doug, as I mentioned earlier, is the Associate Administrator of the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications. Doug joined the Department of Commerce in 2010 and has served in a number of roles working on issues including spectrum management, broadband, and public safety communications. While serving as the head of the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications, Doug created the agency's Broadband USA program, which works to promote broadband deployment and adoption across communities nationwide. He also oversaw a $4 billion grant program that funded the deployment of broadband infrastructure, public computing centers, sustainable adoption of broadband services, and statewide broadband planning. Before joining the Department of Commerce, Doug held multiple executive roles in the communications industry, as well as in the public and private sectors as a telecommunication policy expert. He served as the Vice President of Operations at SoundPath Conferencing, where he was responsible for all sales, marketing, and customer service operations. His private sector experience also includes serving in senior regulatory and policy roles at EXO Communications, NextLink, and LCI. Doug earned his MA in administration from Central Michigan University and his BS in telecommunications management from Ohio University. Our second speaker is Jennifer Duane. Jennifer is a senior broadband specialist from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's Broadband USA program, where she manages the office's grant programs and facilitates interagency coordination to support efforts to streamline the federal permitting processes. Jennifer joined NTIA in 2009 to develop policy for the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, otherwise known as BTOP. She then served 2 years as a senior attorney advisor and the Office of Chief Counsel for NTIA, providing legal advice to NTIA offices on a variety of telecommunications, information technology, and commercial data privacy matters. From 2012 to 2017, she served as the senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary on matters related to broadband and public safety. Before joining NTIA, Jennifer served as a state regulatory attorney and then as a director of federal regulatory affairs for Sprint Corporation. She earned an undergraduate degree in economics from the Pennsylvania State University and a Juris Doctorate degree from George Washington University Law School. Please welcome Doug, and he'll open up the remarks.
Thank you, Susanna. On behalf of NTIA, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on our Notice of Funding opportunity for our Broadband Infrastructure Program. I would also like to mention that last Thursday, NTIA published its Notice of Funding opportunity for its Tribal Broadband Grant Program, and we will have more on that program later today. I think this quote's important. The Vice President's quote underscores the fundamental nature that broadband plays in American society today. It's critical to ensure that all Americans, that's 100% of Americans, have access to fast, affordable broadband to allow them to educate their families, have access to remote healthcare and employment opportunities. These next two slides have maps that I believe highlight two distinct broadband problems that America is facing: infrastructure and digital inclusion. This map, the red areas reflect the areas of the country where broadband service is unavailable at the basic FCC benchmark speed of 25.3. This map highlights households in counties that lack a computer, smartphone, or tablet. The dark brown areas are counties where 30% or more of households do not have a computer, smartphone, or tablet in their home. The broadband divide in this country is significant, and it's one that the administration is now addressing. Next, we're going to dive into the details of the Broadband Infrastructure Grant Program, which is a competitive grant program that opened its application window on May 19th and will award up to $285 million to covered partnerships. Now, I would like to thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the program. Now, let me turn it over to Jennifer Duane, NTIA's Director of Grants. Jennifer?
Well, thanks, Doug. We at NTIA are really excited to be able to announce the opening of the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Now, this program is for $288 million. The eligible applicants are covered partnerships, and those are a state or one or more political subdivisions of a state, and working in collaboration with the fixed broadband service provider. They are deploying covered broadband projects, and these are defined in the Act as a competitively and technologically neutral project for the deployment of fixed broadband service that provides qualifying broadband service in an eligible service area. NTIA announced the opening of the program on May 19th, and we will be accepting applications through August 17th, 2021. I want to highlight a couple of key definitions under the program. First is the definition of qualifying broadband service. That means a download speed of not less than 25 megabits per second and an upload speed of not less than 3 megabits per second with a latency sufficient to support real-time interactive applications. Now, we added a little bit of more context in the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, with regard to the speed. That is the ability to deliver 25.3 simultaneously to every household in the eligible service area. And that's consistent with how USDA Reconnect program, for example, describes the speed threshold for their grant programs. The latency, we added a bit more context as defined as 95% or more of all peak period measurements of network round trip latency, that is between the customer premises and the closest internet core peering interconnection point, are at or below 100 milliseconds. And this is consistent with the FCC's definition of latency that they use in their universal service support programs. So we wanted to be consistent with our federal agency partners in how we define these terms, or this term. The other key definition I want to talk about is the definition of unserved. Now, this means the households lacking access to qualifying broadband service, and no broadband service provider has been selected to receive or is otherwise receiving federal or state funding subject to enforceable build-out commitments to deploy qualifying broadband service in the specific area where the household is located. And eligible service area has been defined in the Act to mean a census block in which broadband service is not available at one or more households or businesses in the census block. And NTIA will be looking at leveraging the FCC's Form 477 data and our National Broadband Availability Map, NBAM, and the FCC Form 77 data is a data layer in that map. And we will be looking at those tools to determine if the area that an applicant submits for funding meets the definition of eligible service area. So under this program, to be eligible for a grant, the covered partnership must submit an application. And we'll be looking at the following elements. We'll be looking at a description of the covered partnership. So we'll want to know whether it's a state or one or more political subdivisions of a state and the fixed broadband service provider. We want to know what the covered broadband project will be, what speeds will be offered, the cost of the project, the proposed service area that the project is proposing to deploy broadband infrastructure in. And then we'll want to know about any other federal and state support that the broadband service provider that is part of the covered partnership might be receiving under another federal or state support program for broadband investments. Now, under the statute, the covered partnership may only submit one application for this grant program. For purposes of we're looking at the state or the political subdivision of the state as the lead applicant, and that would be the entity that would determine whether the covered partnership can submit that application. So the covered partnership may include one or more provider of fixed broadband services in its application. And a fixed broadband service provider may participate in more than one covered partnership, but the state or governmental entity can only submit one application as part of the covered partnership. The Act defines several funding priorities in decreasing order of importance. So the first priority is for projects designed to provide broadband service to the greatest number of households in an eligible service area. Now we'll be interpreting this priority as the providing broadband service to the greatest number of unserved households in the eligible service area. The second priority is focused on providing broadband service in an eligible service area that is outside of a county, city, town, or urbanized area that's contiguous or adjacent to a city or town with more than 50,000 inhabitants. So essentially, we'll be prioritizing broadband service in more rural areas. We'll also be looking at projects that are the most cost-effective, prioritizing projects that are the most rural. And then finally, the fourth criteria is looking at projects designed to provide broadband service with a download speed of at least 100 megabits per second and an upload speed of at least 20 megabits per second. So the Act has given us a very aggressive timeline for deploying broadband infrastructure under this program. It requires that the covered partnership must expend the grant funds within 1 year of their receipt of the grant funds. Now, we know that the projects under this program will be for broadband construction, and that there may be some projects that are capable of deploying broadband within 1 year, but for the most part, applicants will require more than 1 year to complete their broadband construction projects. And in that case, the Act provides that the Assistant Secretary may grant extensions of the award period. So to qualify for the extension, the covered partnership just must certify that it has a plan for use of the funds, the construction project is underway, or extenuating circumstances require an extension to ensure project completion. So we are allowing applicants to submit that request for extension with their application because we realize that most projects will need more than 1 year to complete. So we're giving applicants the option to just go ahead and submit their extension request along with their application. And the petition for extension should cover the elements that I just noted about the factors that the Assistant Secretary will be looking at in terms of whether to grant the extension. So under this program, we have $288 million available in grant funds. We expect to make awards ranging from $5 million to $30 million. Applicants may submit project proposals that are outside of the amounts, but we'll want to see an explanation, a reasonable explanation for why the project cost exceeds these funding ranges. Now, the Act does not require a matching funds, so that is not a statutory requirement as it often is in grant programs, but we will be offering a preference for applicants that do propose to provide a cost share amount to fund a portion of the eligible cost of the project, and looking at least a project that provides a 10% cost match. So to fund, to submit an application under this program, an applicant will need a few things. They'll need a DUNS number, the Dun and Bradstreet number. They'll need to be registered with SAM, the System for Award Management, and they'll need to have a grants.gov account. We'll be using grants.gov for the submission of applications under this program. And the NOFO really goes into detail on all three of these items: how to request a DUNS number, how to register for SAM and to keep that registration active, and how to register for a grants.gov account. So I would direct you to look at the NOFO for those description of those requirements and what is needed to fulfill these three elements to apply for a grant under this program. So the NOFO outlines in Section D the application package for the Broadband Infrastructure Program. We'll be using the standard F424 family of forms, the application for federal assistance, the budget for construction programs, and the 424C. There's a couple of other assurances and certifications regarding lobbying activities that will be required to submit with applications. The project narrative is a Word document where, and this is where the applicant really describes the project, the covered partnership, what they're proposing to deploy and where, the proposed service area, how they're meeting the funding priorities of the Act. So this is where the applicant really should devote most of its time in terms of preparing an application, so they can look at the funding priorities that we'll be focused on and really explain to us how their applications are satisfying the priorities of the program, and looking at identifying exactly what they're doing, measurable milestones, performance outcomes. So this is really the meat of the application that NTIA will be looking at. We'll be also focused on the budget and looking at what costs are proposed for funding under this grant program, and how those costs are aligning against cost objectives that you will see in those standard forms. And then if the applicant is proposing to recover indirect costs, we'll want to see the indirect cost rate agreement. And this is all described in detail in the NOFO. We're also asking for letters of commitment from each of the covered members of the covered partnership to indicate their commitment to complete the project, looking at maps of the eligible service area and financial pro forma documents and network design documents. And those items are all covered in detail in the NOFO as to exactly what we're looking for. So as I mentioned at the beginning, since we opened the program on May 19th, we have a 90-day statutory deadline for when applications must be received. So our deadline under this program is August 17th, 2021. And since it's a statutory definition, we cannot grant any extensions of that timeline. And like applicants, NTIA also has a statutory deadline to complete its review and selection of successful applicants to either complete its review and approve or deny the applications and determine what awards it will make. Our deadline is November 15th, 2021, where we need to make some internal decisions on the applications that we've received under this program. So I want to touch on a couple of the eligible uses for the program. Grant funds may only be expended on allowable costs, and those are outlined in the Uniform Administrative Requirements and the cross principles. The Act also identifies several eligible uses of the grant funds. And since this is a broadband construction grant program, we are, of course, allowing the cost of construction, the improvement or acquisition of facilities and equipment required to provide qualifying broadband service. And this could include infrastructure for backhaul, middle and last mile networks. We're allowing the cost of long-term leases, the cost to engineer the network for permitting, work that's related to environmental and historical cultural reviews, personnel costs, salaries, fringe benefits. And then the Act also allows for reasonable pre-application expenses or grant preparation costs to be recovered, but that amount may not exceed $50,000. The Act also identifies a couple of ineligible costs, and these are costs where grant funds may not be expended on them. So just to touch on a couple of items here, they're described in detail within the NOFO, but so a covered partnership may not use grant funds to purchase or support any communications equipment or service as defined in Section 9 of the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act of 2019. And this is designed to prohibit the purchase of equipment that may pose a national security risk. So we'll be looking to make sure that grant funds are not used for these purchases. And this applies to both members of the covered partnership, so both the state or political subdivision and the fixed broadband service provider. There are a couple of items that are specific to the provider of broadband service that is part of the covered partnership. And that is that grant funds may not use to repay or a loan by a public or private lender, and may not be used for collateral for a loan. Same thing with the grant amount. Preparation costs are allowable, but they may not exceed $50,000. And we also are going to be looking at to not duplicate funding for any funds that have been used to fund service to a location that the FCC Universal Service Program is also funding. So since these are broadband infrastructure projects, there will be environmental and historic preservation requirements that applicants must adhere to. So when you submit your application, we'll be asking for environmental documentation to be submitted. It's not required that you have all of this in place when you submit their application, but we need to understand what environmental, what construction and ground disturbing activities that the project will undertake, and how the environmental and historic preservation requirements will be met. So when we want to see what your plan is for obtaining any of the required federal, tribal, state, local government permits and approvals. So we need sufficient information within the application in order to undertake the analysis that is required by the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. And once we make an award, we may withhold some of the funds under a specific award condition until these environmental preservation environmental and historic preservation requirements are satisfied. So this slide lists the evaluation criteria that NTIA will be looking at when we receive an application for a grant under this program. So the first criteria is we'll be looking at the project purpose and benefits, and that's worth 30 points. So we're going to be looking at the level of impact in the proposed service area. We'll be looking at the number of unserved households that the project is proposing to serve, at what speeds that the service may be offered. We'll be looking at the affordability of the services that will be offered. The second category is project viability, and that's 40 points. We'll be looking at the technical approach and the related network capacity and performance. And that basically means we're going to be looking at the type of network and broadband infrastructure the applicant's proposing to deploy, at what speeds, and we'll be also awarding certain points based on the level of on the network capacity requirements that the applicant will propose. We'll be looking at the applicant's organizational capability as well, looking at the ability, the experience of the applicant, which basically includes the members of the covered partnership, to carry out the project and complete the activities that it proposes to deploy under this grant program. And then finally, we'll be looking at the project budget and sustainability, looking at the reasonableness of the budget and the costs associated with that budget, and to make sure that costs are properly allocated to perform the tasks that are needed to complete the project. We'll be looking at sustainability of the project, whether there's a plan that the project will be sustainable beyond the award period, and looking at whether it's designed to support evolving and advanced communication capabilities such as 5G or fiber. And then finally, we'll be looking at whether the applicant is proposing a non-cost share, and so a non-federal cost share of up to 10%, and the applicant may receive some additional points in consideration if they provide a non-federal cost share that of at least 10% of the total eligible project costs. So this outlines the review process that NTIA will use for this broadband infrastructure program. When we receive applications, the first thing we'll do is conduct an administrative and eligibility review of complete application package, and that's to make sure that the application is complete, that the covered partnership has the entities that are needed to make it eligible to submit an application under this program. And then we'll be looking at what it's proposing to do, because we're going to be doing a priority sequencing. When I discussed the priorities a couple of slides ago, we're going to be the number one priority under the Act is to deliver qualifying broadband service to the greatest number of households in a proposed service area. So we're going to be looking at and focusing initially on applicants that come in with that type of proposal to deliver broadband service to unserved households. And we'll continue that priority sequencing through the remaining priorities to the extent that funding remains available under the program. And the second stage is merit review, and that's where the applicants are evaluated by at least 2 objective reviewers who have demonstrated expertise in the programmatic elements of the grant program. Now we're using a scoring scale of 0 to 100, and applications that score on our threshold between at least 70, that receive at least 70 points and up to 100 points through merit review will advance to our programmatic review. And this is where NTIA will focus on its review of the applications, looking at how the priorities, how the application project advances the funding priorities outlined in the NOFO. And to do this, for instance, in verifying the eligible service area, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be using data from the FCC Form 477 for validation of proposed service areas as eligible. We'll be looking at, leveraging other data sets that are available in the NBAM to target funding to unserved areas. And we'll also have a process for existing broadband service providers to let us know if any proposed service area that has been proposed for funding, whether they currently provide qualifying broadband service to that area. So there's a process outlined in the NOFO where we will announce those proposed service areas and allow existing broadband service providers to provide us with information that essentially may challenge the proposed service areas that an applicant has submitted for funding under this grant program. So this outlines the selection factors and the selection process that NTIA will use when in determining what applications to award grant funding. So we'll be looking at the scores and the technical comments from the objective expert reviewers during merit review. We'll be looking at the analysis of NTIA staff during the programmatic review. We'll be looking how the application satisfies the Broadband Infrastructure Program priorities that I described in the earlier slides, those 4 funding priorities, and then the extent to which the applicant proposes to contribute a non-federal cost share. And then we'll also be looking at an equitable geographic distribution of the proposed grant award. So we're not going to fund projects in only one state. We want to try to make sure that there is a equitable geographic distribution across the country. It doesn't necessarily mean that every state will get an award, but we do want to make sure that we're distributing the awards in an equitable manner geographically. And then we'll be looking at the extent to which this investment would not have been made in the proposed service area without the government investment. So, or that is unlikely to be made using private sources of funds and needs the government investment in order to be funded. And then we'll be looking at whether the applicant proposes some strong labor protections, including paying prevailing wages. And then finally, we'll be looking to avoid duplicating the funding of other federal agencies, including the Department of Agriculture loan and grant programs and the applicable universal service programs that the FCC manages. And then finally, the availability of funds will be determining how many awards we are able to make for this program. With $288 million, it's not a lot to fund broadband infrastructure deployment, so that will be a key determinant of the amount and the number of awards that we're able to award here. And this just highlights a couple of just award administration information that will be applicable to awardees. So applicants that we do fund under this program will receive a federal award notice. It'll be from our the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which is our grants office under this program. We will, of course, notify applicants that are not successful in receiving an award. But if you do receive an award, there will be certain administrative and national policy requirements that you have to adhere to. The Uniform Administrative Requirements and Cost Principles. The Department of Commerce has some standard financial assistance terms and conditions that will apply. Of course, the environmental, national historical preservation requirements I touched on earlier will come into play here. Looking at, there will be some requirements that any grant funded assets under this program that will have a federal interest in, and will have a property trust relationship with any assets that are funded under this program. There'll be a requirement for open network requirements to keep the network our infrastructure that's funded under this program to be open for interconnection by other broadband service providers. And looking at domestic preference for procurements or Buy American, and then looking at contracting with small minority business, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus areas firms, looking for preferences and contracting with those entities. And then finally, reporting. There'll be reporting requirements that are outlined in the NOFO, both financial reporting and performance reporting on a semi-annual basis. And then there will also be an annual reporting requirement where we'll be looking at awardees to tell us what they expended their grant funds on, what outcomes and services they delivered as a result of using grant funds under this program. So as I described on a couple of slides, we do have a merit review process where we are using objective reviewers to look at the applications that were received. So we are actively looking for merit reviewers to submit, to volunteer to serve as a reviewer for this program. So we'll start merit reviews in August and into October, and we really just want to make this an announcement and ask for your help to volunteer to serve as a reviewer for this program. You can submit a resume at the information at the email noted here, grantreviewer@ntia.gov, and provide the information that's indicated in the bullet points on this slide: your name, residence, email, employer, position, years of experience, and in fields related to broadband activities. So I hope you'll consider volunteering for this, to serve as a merit reviewer for this program. We would definitely welcome your help. So now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Susanna Spellman, and we will now entertain questions on the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jennifer and Doug. I also wanted to make you all aware of our special guest, Dean Iwasaki. He is from the NIST Grants Office, who will be working with us to administer the grants from the financial and grant administrative side of things. We've got a lot of great questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as possible, but I also want to put a plug that literally 15 minutes before we got on this webinar, we were able to post on the Broadband USA website a second round or second set of frequently asked questions. So a lot of the questions that you may have circulating in your brain are in that FAQ, hopefully. And if they're not in there, and if we don't address it today, we will try to take that and address that into future sets of FAQs that we'll release. And we're hoping to release pretty regularly as we get questions and as we're able to answer them. So sit tight for that. Let's get started. Here's one question that popped up, and it was one of the most recent questions, so it's close to mine. Jennifer, are both last mile and middle mile networks funded under this grant program subject to the interconnection requirements outlined in the NOFO?
Thanks, Susanna, for that question. So as we mentioned in the NOFO, that these, the awards under this program are subject to open network requirements. It's only middle mile networks that are subject to this requirement. Last mile networks are not. And if there is a project that contains both middle mile and last mile components, only the middle mile portion would be subject to the open network requirements that are outlined in the NOFO.
Great. Another question about covered partnerships, specifically which member of the covered partnership would or could retain the ownership of the infrastructure or associated assets funded by the program?
So that's a great question. Under covered partnership is not a technical grant term. It is a term that is very specific to this particular statute. So the applicant is a covered partnership, but when make an award, the recipient or subrecipients, they essentially become either one of those categories. Since the governmental entity under this program is the lead applicant, so that's either the state or one or more political subdivisions of the state, that is the lead applicant, they become the recipient, and a fixed broadband provider that is part of their partnership can be the subrecipient. Either one of those entities, or a subrecipient or a recipient, it may hold title to property that is funded under this program with federal funds.
All right, one more for Jennifer, and then I have a few for Doug. What entities qualify as political subdivisions of a state? So for example, a few folks have asked if a public utility district or a school district would be qualified.
That's another great question, Susanna. So the Act did not define what a political subdivision is, and we didn't define it either in the NOFO because we didn't want to be too prescriptive. And we know that state statutes may define, essentially political subdivisions are creations of the state, and are created to fulfill certain governmental functions. They're usually defined in state statutes. So we wanted to not be too restrictive in this regard and just leave it up to the political subdivision or in the specific state to let us know if they qualify as a political subdivision under their state law. So, and it's possible that a school district or a public utility district could be defined as a political subdivision in the particular state law where those entities are located. So what we'll suggest that these entities do is to, if they file an application under the program and are partnering with a fixed broadband service provider, that when they, in their project narrative, when it calls for them to describe and define the covered partnership entities, that they provide us with a cite to the specific state statute that defines what a political subdivision is and how they fit within that definition to qualify to submit an application as part of the covered partnership.
So along that same vein, Doug, are municipally owned networks or public utility owned networks by themselves considered a covered partnership, since they are both a broadband provider and part of a government entity?
Yeah, the short answer is no. The way the statute is written in the NOFA is that it envisions two, a state or political subdivision and a provider. So the municipal network, even if it meets the definition of being a political subdivision, they would have to choose to either be the political, in the state or the political subdivision, or the provider. They cannot step in the shoes of both of them and file a single application acting as both the political subdivision or state and the provider.
Right. Another question in regards to previous federal funding. Would any location that has received prior FCC universal service funding be ineligible for funding under this program?
No, they would not be prohibited from filing an application with us. The NOFA is clear that any eligible area, any area is eligible if it does not have 25/3 service. There are areas in which I'm sure that the FCC, for example, RDOF funding will service various census tracts, but maybe not every home or part of that census tract will be served. And those areas would still be eligible to apply for federal funding under our program.
So just to follow on, to zone in a little bit more on the RDOF funding. So our service areas that were preliminarily awarded in the FCC RDOF program, are they excluded as eligible service areas, even though a final award has not been made?
No, they are not excluded. At this time, the FCC has made preliminary decisions but have not awarded funding. At this time, I would view those as still eligible. And given that they have not gone through the long form with the FCC and been, I guess, finalized or actually awarded. Jennifer, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, that's right, Doug. I think, we're closely coordinating with the FCC and USDA, given that one of the requirements of this program is not to fund eligible service areas that are already receiving funding from another federal program or source. So we're going to be coordinating with them when we receive applications for specific proposed service areas to make sure, so we understand what has already been previously funded and what what is still to come. But the threshold for us is looking at an unserved as whether it's lacks qualifying broadband service, and also whether the federal or state support is subject to enforceable build out commitments with dates certain. At this point, some of the RDOF funding, especially that's still preliminarily decided and not formally decided, would not meet that definition of being, subject to an enforceable build out commitment. So at that point, it's still eligible for funding under our program, but it's something that we're going to need to closely coordinate with the FCC to make sure that we're not, funding two locations or the same locations with two sources of federal funding.
So a lot of people are asking about the Form 477 data, in particular, if it shows that their intended service areas as served. They're wondering if they have field work or other data elements that can show evidence that contradict the federal broadband maps. Will NTIA consider the applicant's argument and data sets to address that, whether or not the eligible service areas should be considered unserved?
Yes, absolutely. So when they come in and submit their application, and one of the they need to define what their proposed service area is, and they should provide any documentation they have that supports their finding that this area lacks qualifying broadband service. So we'll accept any information from an applicant that to substantiate that position through maps. If they're disputing the FCC Form 477 data, we're definitely open to looking at that. We also have our national broadband availability map that we're going to leverage to look at service areas to determine what meets the definition of unserved. We have data from the FCC Form 477 as a data layer within the map. We also have data from the census. We have speed data from Ookla, Broadband Now. We have, I forget how many data layers we have in there, Doug, you may know, but we have a lot of data there that we're going to leverage for this purpose.
Yeah, we will be leveraging the MBAM map, which incorporates the FCC data, 477, CAP2, et cetera. It also includes individual state layers. We have 36 states that are currently participating in the National Broadband Availability Map, or NBAM. So there is Ookla, there's MLabs, there are Microsoft download data, the FCC data, state layer. So we're already using alternative layers. I think we have 236 data layers in the map to help get a clearer picture on what is served or unserved. But any additional information that you have would be welcomed at the time of the filing of your application.
Great. There was a question about what programs does NTIA consider to be part of USF? The CAF programs, the ACAM programs, traditional rate of return, any others?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember them all.
I know there's a bunch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they would all be. I think whatever that, depending on the context of the question, right? I think the legislation and the NOFA state that any federal funding, including those under the Universal Service Fund, like RDOF, et cetera, would be included. As Jennifer said, we meet literally weekly with the FCC, USDA, starting to try to bring Treasury into that on data sharing, not just for our program, but for their programs. So all of that information is being shared. So I just don't want to name two and miss a third one, but yeah, all the USF funding mechanisms would be part of that decision making.
Here's another question. Can a state submit an application and a town from that state also submit an application?
So the state could submit an application, assuming it's needs to partner with a fixed broadband service provider. A town within the state, as a assuming it meets the state's definition of political subdivision and partners with a fixed broadband service provider, could also submit an application. Where the Act limits a covered partnership to a single application. So for purposes of this definition, we're looking at the governmental entity as determining the covered partnership single application requirement. So a state could only submit a single application. A town or political subdivision of that state can only submit a single application. But both need to be paired with fixed broadband service providers to meet the definition of covered partnership to be able to submit an application under the program.
Okay, this is another tricky question here. And I think we do address this in the FAQs, but we got to get a few questions about this. If a census block is partially served at the qualifying broadband speed of 25 down, 3 up, does it qualify? If according to the FCC's national broadband map, a census block has fixed broadband service, however, that service for that census block or part of that census block is less than the qualifying broadband speed, is that service area eligible?
Yes, because we're going to be looking at, the areas of a census block that are not served with qualifying broadband service. So to the extent that there is a portion of a census block or a political subdivision that does not have, that lacks access to qualifying broadband service, then yes, that portion of the census block would be eligible to propose for funding under this grant program.
Here's an easy question. I'm going to answer it. Do you include fixed wireless as a part of the fixed broadband service provider? Yes, fixed wireless is an eligible broadband service under the purposes of this program. So here's another question that has to do with sizes of communities and a little bit of eligibility, but also priorities. Can a community that exceeds the population threshold of more than 50,000 residents, but otherwise qualifies under the other priorities, apply to the grant program?
Yes, we've gotten that question a couple of times because I think there is some confusion there. So just that there, we're not defining rural as part of this program. That definition just goes to priority. It's a prioritization factor. It's not an eligibility factor. So it doesn't mean that an area that exceeds those population limits can apply to the program. But it's this program the prioritization factors that were outlined in the Act has prioritized serving rural areas. So, that just needs to be a consideration for the, that area coming in, is that they can still come in. It's not that they're not eligible, but in terms of the prioritization factor, we're going to be needing to focus or prioritizing areas that are more rural in nature.
So this is a kind of a follow-on question that has to do with prioritization. So given, as you discussed, the scoring priority and criteria, is NTIA prioritizing large-scale projects that propose to serve the largest number of unserved locations? Is that prioritized over smaller projects serving a single political subdivision with a service provider?
No, we're looking at the first prioritization factor in the statute, which is to serve the greatest number of unserved households in a proposed service area. So that's what we're going to be starting at in terms of looking at when we begin to look at applications to fund. That's the first prioritization factor that we'll look at, but we're not excluding other prioritization factors identified in the statute, like serving rural areas, projects that exceed the 100 megabits per second, or upload and 20 megabits per second download. They're all part of our funding priorities, and multiple priority. We use that as a selection factor. So applications that are come in with more than that are proposing more than one of our priorities, and that would be something we would factor in during the selection process.
So I got an interesting question, and I think there's kind of two questions in it. They're asking if this program is available for state or only for federally recognized tribes. So I think that's a question about this program, the Broadband Infrastructure Program, but then also opens the door for us to let folks know about the other program that was announced last week.
Yeah, so for this program, it's it's for states or one or more political subdivisions of a state, and then the fixed broadband service provider. So those are the entities that are eligible to apply for this program. So it has to be a state that's part of it, or one or more political subdivisions, or a fixed broadband service provider. We did announce last Thursday, June 3rd, the opening of our Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, and that has $980 million available for award, and that is specifically targeted toward tribal, federally recognized tribal governments. There's also eligible entities can also include tribal colleges and universities, the Alaska Native corporations, Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and tribal organizations. So there's 5 eligible entities that could apply for that program. So it seems like a tribal entity would be better suited for the Tribal Broadband Program, and that is both for broadband infrastructure deployment and for broadband use and adoption.
Great. Here's a question about the challenge process that you talked about that I know is towards the end of the NOFO. Will an applicant know when their areas are challenged during the challenge process? And is there a process for that applicant to provide additional data to show the area is unserved?
So we're gonna, when we have an application in for merit review, we'll post the proposed service areas on our website, and that will open up the opportunity for existing broadband service providers to submit data that is opposing that designation as an unserved area. So when we'll be factoring in, we'll be pretty much looking at that during our programmatic review process, and we'll be reaching back out to the applicant if there is a challenge that looks compelling. We will want to give the applicant an opportunity to provide some additional information to substantiate its determination that this proposed service area is truly unserved and eligible for funding.
So here's a really great question. If an applicant submits proposals, can any of their employees also serve as merit reviewers?
Well, it depends. I mean, because they couldn't serve as a merit reviewer on that proposal because that would be a conflict of interest, but it's possible that they could be assigned to other proposals that come in, but we have a conflict of interest form that would have to be disclosed, and we'd have to make that determination whether that they could serve as a merit reviewer. But it's possible that they could. We would just need to assign them to projects where they would not, where their association with one proposal would not be a factor in their evaluation of other proposals.
So could they also potentially be a merit reviewer for the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program or the Connecting Minority Communities Program too?
Yeah, I think so. As long, I mean, that might be the way to siphon them out, is to direct them to the other programs that we have, because we have 3 ground programs that we're standing up almost simultaneously. We have this program, our Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, and another program, Connecting Minority Communities. And so we need merit reviewers for all 3 of those. So we encourage folks to submit their information and qualifications to the merit reviewer inbox that identified in the slide deck, and we'll be considering those applications and reaching out and contacting interested people who want to serve as merit reviewers, because we definitely are welcoming that participation.
Right. Doug, can this grant be used to connect last mile community anchor institutions such as schools, libraries, first responders, recreation areas, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it is a infrastructure project that allows, right? Primary focus is unserved household, but does not prohibit connection of community anchors institutions as part of their application.
All right, so right now, bear with me. I'm going through all the questions that you've been coming in through chat right now. I had a lot queued up from you guys, but I'm going through, and I think some of them we're answering, which is good. And I know a lot of them are answered in the FAQs that we just posted. So if we don't get to them here, please look at those. Oh, here's a question for Dean. Do you have to have an annual audit report for each partnership as future reporting requirements?
Okay, so we're developing the reporting requirements, right now. So just off the bat, federal-wide, as a recipient of federal funding, as long as you receive, I think it's $750,000 in federal funding, during the fiscal year, you'd be required to submit a single audit. So regardless of what the program specific requirements may be for this program, just as a recipient of a federal grant, if you meet that threshold of $750K, then you would be required to submit a single audit. If you are, a state government or a nonprofit organization, for-profit entities are a different story.
So we're getting a few questions about getting access to the NTIA's National Broadband Availability Map, specifically how to get access to it, and then if individual citizens have access to it.
So right now we have arrangements with, as I stated, 36 states through joint program agreements. It is a closed map as of now, meaning that it's available only to federal entities and state entities. The states that have signed a joint program agreement can identify who has access to that and may be willing to work with a political subdivision to give them access. They would have access to various commercial data sets as well as their own state data. But the provider would not have access to that data under our agreement and arrangements with both the contractual arrangements we have with the data providers and with the state JPAs.
Are there any rules requiring a proposed funded service area to be contiguous or within a single county?
No, that you can, it basically has to meet the qualifying broadband definition. They do not need to be contiguous, adjoining, etc. So you could have multiple locations in a state that the state political subdivision and the provider are going to address in this application.
Here's a question. Can a state or a political subdivision partner with more than one service provider?
Yes.
Yes.
I think it gets to your last question. You may have multiple locations in one application served by multiple service providers, and they might both, 2, 3, multiples be part of that application process.
So here's a twist on that. What if the applicant is the state, but then its partner is a different service provider in that area? So is that 2 applications or 1 application? So the question, I'm just going to verbatim write it, say it. Can a state partner with 2 different fixed broadband providers on projects in the state in 2 separate applications?
And they wouldn't want to do it in 2 separate applications. Right. They'd want to, because the state can only submit 1 application, so they would want to have these other fixed service providers as their, partners in 1 overall application that they would submit under the program, so they could combine different eligible service areas within their project proposal, but they would want to combine it into 1 single application, because the state is just limited to submitting a single application for the program.
So we're getting a few questions about, I think, more explicit details about the open requirements for the middle mile network. Is there any other data or requirements besides what's in the NOFO that we could share with potential applicants?
I mean, right now, okay, go ahead. I mean, right now, that's just what we're outlining in the NOFO as a requirement. It's going to be, we'll handle it as a specific award condition after the award, and we'll be able to, I think, go into more detail then. But right now, it's just more of a note at putting, applicants on notice that there will be open network requirements associated with grants under this program. The outline of what would be, and I don't know that it's going to be much different than what we've outlined in the NOFO, but it just, puts applicants on notice that these open network requirements will apply to award under the program.
Yeah, I would just add that we use open access. We're talking about interconnection. At reasonable points on the network at just and reasonable rates. So, I mean, nothing that a carrier probably doesn't do today in their wholesale markets. So the intent is, to be able to leverage those middle miles to expand to other unserved or underserved areas down the road.
There's another question. It's kind of a grants performance question. Will NTIA require performance testing of the location served under this program?
It's like speed testing or things like that?
I think so. They didn't specify.
I mean, one of the things, we have some reporting requirements outlined in the NOFO, and they're basically taken verbatim from the statute, and that's what the statute requires. We're contemplating putting more definition on, on reporting requirements, but to do so, we would need to go through a Paperwork Reduction Act submission. So we're contemplating doing that, and so there'll be more detail about any specific reporting requirements that will be that will apply to the program. We'll have more detail on that once we do that PRA submission. So it could be something that's part of that we consider, but right now it's not part of it. And Doug, do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think that, as you said, it's a possibility to add it to the PRA and then therefore become part of our, kind of our, I don't want to say audits, but we of our oversight and verification that we are getting delivered what was in the application. So I think you're right, Jennifer. That's where we would put it.
Dean, we have a follow-up audit question for you. If the parent company has an audit report that encompasses all subsidiaries, would this type of audit report suffice for the requirements, or would each individual subsidiary have to create its own audit report due to the $750K threshold you just discussed?
So I'm talking about actually the federal single audit requirement. So it's a little different than a standard audit. There's specific things that an auditor would look for. And again, you would have to meet that threshold, and you would have to be, be that type of entity. So a for-profit entity that this requirement doesn't apply. In terms of subsidiaries, I mean, typically that's not part of the required entities makeup. So I don't think this particular individual that the single audit requirement would apply to, because again, it's typically, or it's state entities or governmental entities, nonprofit organizations, tribes, and none of them have subsidiaries or what I would define as a subsidiary.
Okay. Here's another kind of audit question. Is the ISP required to have audited financial statements for prior years? I'm assuming this is a part of the application.
Yeah, so we typically, and so the ISP, right? So if
so it's not the lead applicant.
Yeah, so typically we go for the lead applicant is the ones that we do the pre-award clearances on, and not the subrecipients or partners. So in terms of needing audits, generally for our purposes, no, we wouldn't need that.
Here's a good question.
Go ahead. Just add on, Suzanne. I think within one of the documents that we asked for within the application packages for financial statements, but more specific to the project and project specific, not necessarily historical financial information about the covered partner. We're just mainly focused on some financial cash flow statements, the balance sheet information that's really more specific to the project than the entity that's submitting the application. And that's described in the NOFO as part of the application submission package.
Doug, I think this is a favorite question for you. Can a proposed funded service area be smaller than a census block?
Yeah, we haven't defined the service areas. It's again, meets the eligibility threshold, and it can be, as the legislation and the NOFA say, a single household or business in a census tract would make that would be an eligible area. So it could be as small as, I would think, an individual business or even household, even though that may not make a good business case, it can be smaller than that.
So we've got a few questions about using match funds from either the American Rescue Plan or the CARES Act funding. Are political subdivisions allowed to use that funding towards their match?
So I think when we got that question yesterday, and I think we'll probably put it into our third round of FAQs, because we just need to confirm. In general, matching funds may not come from other federal sources. So they need to be coming from non-federal sources. But there are a few federal statutes that I think, the Community Block Grant, Development Block Grant comes to mind, that specifically allow funding under their program to be used as match in other federal programs. And I just don't know offhand what those statutes require. So we'll just need to check that and run it through legal, and then we'll address it in our third round of of frequently asked questions, which we're already working on, Susanna.
Yep. All right, going through. And someone asked when the reporting requirements will be completed. I think the NOFO does include high-level reporting requirements that will be required, but as Doug and Jennifer
so there's,
said,
yeah, semi-annual reporting requirements. After you receive an award, you report semi-annually on your performance progress, and also there's financial reporting to submit. The annual reporting would kick in a year after you receive funds. So we'll be working on like I said, with anything that's not specifically delineated in the statute that we want to collect. We'll need to do a paper, a PRA submission, and so we'll be working on that. But the obligation to report doesn't kick in, since it's an annual reporting requirement, doesn't kick in until a year after your receipt of the funds.
So this is another question along the financials. For the financial forecast that's required as a part of the application, is it a 5-year view, 10-year view, 15-year view?
From the project, like,
for the financial forecast, for the income statement, balance sheet, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we didn't really define a period. I think projects are under this grant program are supposed to be completed within a year. So, but we know that's not likely to be the case. But so we didn't specify a particular time frame. So I think we're leaving it open to applicants to come in. I think 5-year period or less is probably sufficient. Doug, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think 5 years would be the number I would be looking for at a minimum.
Here's another tricky question. Does the application need to demonstrate evidence of an unserved address in every single census block within the project area?
Can you repeat that? I want to make sure I heard that.
I know. Does the application need to demonstrate evidence of an unserved address in every single census block within the project area?
I think the answer is you need to demonstrate that the area or the houses or the businesses you plan to serve, right, meet the conditions of qualifying under this program. So every single house, or you can show a region, but yes, there has to be a demonstration of some point in your application that if you're doing 2 or 3 different census tracts, that the areas you're proposing, let's just say households, are unserved in those tracts. I'm understanding the question, right?
Yeah, I think that's it.
So you can't do 2 of the 3 tracks and then ignore the third one and say that's and then just not make any demonstration that it's unserved.
Right. All right. I'm still going through some of the questions. And like I said, folks, if we're not answering your question, it's because we know it's answered in an FAQ that's upcoming, or we know that it's a question that we need to talk about internally because it's a tougher question. We need to run it past legal, talk to our partners about it, et cetera. And we will address it in future FAQs that come out. All right, what else? I think that is about it in terms of the questions that I think we're able to address today. Trying to think. There's another one that just came in. This is a good question. If multiple political subdivisions jointly apply for a grant, is it possible that NTIA might award the grant for a portion of the communities, but not all of them? In other words, is it all or nothing for communities that jointly file an application? Or can NTIA work with the applicant to adjust their service area based on any findings from other federal investments, et cetera?
No, I think we would work with the, the entire application, the proposed service area. And if there were some portions of it that, didn't qualify for funding because of it was already being funded through another source, I think we would work with the applicant to we could de-scope the service area, but we wouldn't necessarily outright reject it. I think we would work to see what areas were truly unserved, meeting our definition of unserved, and see what we could fund.
So we just got a question if a copy of the presentation available. So by, I believe, sometime next week, late next week, we will post this presentation, a transcript of the actual webinar, as well as a video recording of this webinar. And there was yesterday's webinar as well, and there were a lot of questions there too, some that were the same as this last one, the same as this one. So it might be worthwhile watching or reading the transcript of the Q&A portions for both these webinars. You might learn something new that we didn't get to address on today's call. All right, got it. I think that is about it in terms of what we can address. Any other last statements, Dean, Doug, Jennifer?
No, we're excited to have the NOFA out there. We're excited to work with the states and the providers to get this connected, right? The administration, this is a small step in the direction of getting 100% of Americans connected. And please feel free to reach out with your questions to us, because if you have it, others will have it. We can work those into our future FAQs. And we'll be doing, I believe, Susanna, the slide, or do we have a slide on the next webinars?
Oh, Carol, if you could, yes,
sorry.
Thank you.
Just so folks know, we'll be doing more webinars, not just on this program, on July 14th, 15th, but also on the Tribal coming up and on the Connecting Minority Communities program. So thank you for joining us today. Anybody else?
No, thanks. As Susanna mentioned, we're working diligently to address all the frequently asked questions that you're submitting to us, and we're trying to establish a weekly cadence of releasing those FAQs. So we release some today, and our goal is to release the third round next week around this time. So submit your questions. As I mentioned yesterday, we may not be able to address project-specific questions or give you a oh, this looks good, if you're wanting to share what you're thinking about in terms of your project proposal. We're not able to address those kind of specific project proposals in advance of the application submission, but we will try to respond to questions that we can that are more generic, and we will work on responding to those questions as quickly as possible.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and please stay tuned and check the Broadband USA website regularly as we update with more information, more FAQs, or other announcements.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.